Our next speaker might be the most famous person in the world when it comes to helping the private sector reinvent the way it does business in order to support a healthy economy and strong communities. David Osborne is the author or co-author of 5 books, including The Price of Government and Reinventing Government. David is a senior partner at the Public Strategies Group, an international consulting firm that helps public organizations develop and implement strategies to improve their performance. He's worked with governments, large and small, from cities and counties to states, federal agencies, and foreign governments. Recognizing the seriousness of the fiscal crisis facing Oregon, the business community enlisted Public Strategies to generate ideas on how to tackle them. We were joined by the Oregon Community Foundation, the Meyer Memorial Trust, and the Ford Family Foundation, which provided resources to support this work, and we thank them heartily for their support. We've drawn on some of their ideas as we develop the business plan recommendations. Today, we've asked David to put Oregon in national perspective and help spark our thinking about how to turn our fiscal challenges into an opportunity. Please welcome David Osborne.
Thank you, Pat, for that kind introduction, and good morning to all of you. It's great to be here with you. I've been actually following Oregon, what you do in the public sector, for 20 years, since you created the Oregon benchmarks and the Oregon Progress Board, which at the time were a huge breakthrough that had enormous influence around the country. And having read your Oregon business plan, I expect similar breakthroughs in the period ahead, because it is truly a terrific plan. You know, it's an interesting time we live in. There was a French poet 100 years ago who I think captured the message of this morning very well. The trouble with our times is that the future is not what it used to be. You have a deep fiscal problem in Oregon, but the truth is you're typical. 45 states have deep fiscal problems. If you had oil, gas, or coal and taxed it well, you'd be among the 5 that are okay. But you're not. You're a little worse than average because your economy is a little worse than average. But the really bad news that I have to bring you this morning is that the main factor in this structural fiscal crisis is not the recession. The recession is terrible and has had a huge impact. But when it ends, you're going to continue to have a structural deficit as far as the eye can see. And most of America is, because we are caught in inexorable national trends. And I want to just show you some data to try to prove it to you. This is how we spend our state and local money. Since 1970, it goes through 2008, which is the most recent data available. What stands out to you on that graph? Anyone? A hint, I put it in red. In 1970, we spent about 10% of our state and local money on health care. By 2008, it was 20%. And you can see that it actually went down a little from 2005 to 2008. That's because at the top of the business cycle, when unemployment is low, Medicaid rolls fall. But I can promise you that in the last 3 years, Medicaid rolls have exploded, and it's probably up to 22 or 23% now. Now look at just state government. This is all state spending from 1987 to 2008. And there's a short blue line labeled all health. The reason for that is that the National Association of State Budget Officers for 6 years collected data on all health spending at the state level, not just Medicaid, but the children's program, the employee insurance, retirees, the whole picture. They must have had a grant to do it because they stopped doing it after 2003. But you can see that by 2003, health was almost the largest category of state budgets, and by now, I'm sure it is. Now, the GAO in Washington, the Government Accountability Office, before the recession, 3 or 4 years ago, looked at these trends and said, okay, if we project state spending on a sort of continuing as is with health care, pensions, and all the other things that states spend money on, what does the future look like for state and local government before the recession? And this is what they came up with. The blue line is the one to look at because the red line includes capital budgets, and that's supposed to be debt. But the blue line is supposed to be positive. You can see that from 1980 through about 2007, it was quite, it averaged about 0.5% of GDP above zero. State and local governments generally had surpluses. There was one period where they dipped into the negative. But beginning in about 2008, they predicted a long, slow slide. There are two reasons for that. We are caught in basically a perfect storm. It's become a cliche, but there are two huge forces affecting public budgets. The first is healthcare. For 50 years, we have spent 10% more on healthcare on average every year in this country. That's not all inflation. A couple of percentage points is population growth. But that's been the average, 10% a year. The second is demographic. The baby boomers are retiring. The first wave of baby boomers hits 65 next year. And that has a huge impact, has already had an impact on public pension systems because public pension systems are generous and people typically get to retire with quite good benefits after 30 years. So they retire well before 65 in many cases. So those two things are really driving the crisis. And that means that we are on a path that is unsustainable. I've been preaching this for a long time. I think people finally believe it. Bureaucratic governments, unfortunately, are simply not capable of innovation at the rate we need, given this fiscal reality. That means we have to reinvent them. We have to take these public institutions and change them in fundamental ways so that every year they produce better results with less money. And that's a heavy lift. Now, when I talk about bureaucracy, most people think bureaucracy just means big organizations. It's almost a synonym for large organization. But you folks are in business, you know that's not true. Bureaucracy is a particular kind of organization. And it didn't become the norm in this country until the 20th century. And today, many businesses are no longer bureaucracies. They are organized differently. They use network strategies. They're flatter. Apple Computer isn't a bureaucracy. But most of our public organizations still are. And when I use the word bureaucracy, I'm not being pejorative. 100 years ago, it was a good word because bureaucracy was reform. We imported bureaucracy as a form of organization into government to solve huge problems. Because when this country went through the Industrial Revolution and our cities exploded in the 1890s and the early part of the 1900s, governments of the time couldn't deal with those new problems because we ran government with what people have come to call the spoils system. When the Republicans got elected, they fired all the Democrats and hired campaign workers and nieces and nephews, even in the schools. And when Democrats got elected, they did the same thing. So to solve that, to create capacity, we imitated the private sector. We sort of imitated the emerging Ford GM model of organization. We created lots of rules and regulations to prevent the bad behavior that was getting in the way of performance. We invented civil service systems, which are nothing but HR systems laden with rules. We invented new procurement rules to keep people from stealing. We invented budget systems that are heavy on control and rules. We created centralized hierarchical management systems, on the sort of GM model. We tried to standardize services because in the 1800s, if Italian Americans controlled the city government, then Italian Americans got the good services, and other ethnic groups didn't. So it was a huge push to create equal services for everyone. We use command and control methods where the customer, the citizen, or the business had no power in relation to the government organization, and in most cases, we use monopolies. And that's kind of how we did government in the 20th century. And the truth is, it worked. The history of government in this country in the last century is a history of enormous achievement. We created the most powerful economy on earth. We won 2 world wars. We doubled our living standards between 1945 and 1970, doubled them. Huge success. And then something happened. The world changed. The industrial age began to fade, the information age was born, and the conditions changed. We moved from a world of stability in which stable bureaucracies worked fine to a world of rapid change. We moved from a world of linear work processes to a world of information technology. We moved from a world where people expected just sort of mediocre services from government, and that was okay, to a world where, thanks to you folks, thanks to business and technology, people expect higher quality. We moved from a world where basically we had mass markets. We had 3 TV networks, we had 3 dominant news magazines, etc., to a world of demassified markets with enormous amounts of choices. We moved to a world of global competition and severe fiscal restraints. And in that environment, top-down, rule-driven bureaucracies, particularly if they're monopolies, do not function very well, whether they're in the private sector, the nonprofit sector, or the public sector. So we've begun to change them. If you want to be successful in today's world, you need to be agile, you need to be innovative, you need to focus on results, be accountable to your customers, use competition to drive excellence, and be able to continuously improve. And that's what we're after. So, we reinvented government between about 1890 and 1945 using bureaucracy as our goal. Now we need to reinvent it again. And it's been going on since really the late 70s, when we had a tax revolt in local government in much of America. But for 30 years, we've been kind of nibbling around the edges. And because of this permanent fiscal crisis that's going to be with us for the rest of our lifetimes, we can't nibble anymore. We need bold changes. So I'm going to talk about a couple of things this morning. First, the most important driver in any government organization is the budget, how you allocate your resources. And if you want change, you have to do that differently. So I'm going to talk about that. Secondly, we have to redesign our service systems. So you've seen from these graphs that the 2 biggest systems we fund in government, particularly at the state level, are education and healthcare. So corrections is another big one. I'm not going to have time for that, but I'm going to try to talk about education and healthcare. So let's start with budgets. How does it work today? Well, in most places, basically, let's say I'm a program manager in state government, and I get the budget instructions, and I have to prepare my budget request. So what I do is I take last year's costs, those are assumed, all of them are assumed, and then I add inflation, and I add caseload increases if I've got them, or if the governor or mayor has asked me to do something new, I add that, and that all becomes my base. And I fight hard to get things into the base. I turn it in. And when I turn it in, basically I'm saying, these are my costs, and here's how I justify them. Now, what are the incentives that operate on me? If I'm a smart, experienced manager, I know that in this fiscal environment, I'm not going to get all I asked for. In fact, I'm probably going to get a lot less. So what do I do if I want to make sure my program can work well after it's cut? What does a rational person do in that situation? They pad their budget request. And if I've been around the block a few times, I've gotten pretty good at hiding the padding. So that's what people do all across America at budget time.